The explosion ripped through the Stellar Guardian's port side with the subtlety of a nuclear dawn. Zach Anderson gripped his workstation as the ship's artificial gravity fluctuated, sending tools floating in lazy arcs across the engineering bay. Warning klaxons screamed through the corridors, their urgent wail mixing with the hiss of ruptured pressure seals. "Status report," Captain Barrett's voice crackled over the intercom, steady despite the chaos. Zach's fingers flew across the holographic interface. "Residential Sector B is completely compromised, Captain. We've lost 30% of our living quarters." He squinted at the damage readouts. "Environmental systems are holding in the remaining sections, but barely. Casualties? None reported. Emergency protocols got everyone out in time." Zach allowed himself a small breath of relief. The ship's AI had done its job, sealing off the affected areas before catastrophic decompression could claim any lives. "Engineering, I need solutions. Now." Before Zach could respond, a new voice cut through the channel. Precise, cold, and distinctly non-human. "Captain, this is engineering expert Arital. The human's assessment is incomplete. We're losing structural integrity in adjacent sections at a rate of—" "I can see the numbers," Zach interrupted, irritation flaring. "But if we reroute power from the tertiary systems, an imprecise solution that violates 14 safety protocols, that will save the ship." The captain's voice cut through their argument. "Enough. You two are our best engineers. I don't care about protocols or creative solutions right now. I care about keeping this ship intact. Work together. Bear it out." Zach pushed away from his console, turning to face his new partner. Arital stood ramrod straight at her workstation, her blue skin catching the emergency lighting in a way that would have been beautiful if not for the disdain evident in her posture. Like all Yartalians, she possessed an otherworldly grace, but her features were sharp, angular, engineered for efficiency rather than aesthetics. "Look," Zach said, running a hand through his disheveled dark hair, "we can argue methodology later. Right now, your creative solutions have already caused 3 system failures this month," Ari cut in. "The Yartal Engineering Corps does not approve of improvisation." "Yeah, well, we're not on Yartal, are we?" Zach moved to her station, pointing at the structural analysis. "See these stress patterns? Traditional repairs won't hold. We need to think outside the box." Ari's luminescent eyes narrowed. "The box exists for a reason, Engineer Anderson." Before their argument could escalate, Lieutenant Wong burst into the engineering bay. "We've got bigger problems. With Residential B gone, we're implementing emergency quarters redistribution. You two are sharing room 2187. "What?" They spoke in unison, causing Zach to smirk and Ari to scowl. "One room, one bunk," Wong continued, already backing toward the door. "Captain's orders. No exceptions. Figure it out after you save our ship." As the lieutenant disappeared, Zach turned back to the engineering console, trying not to think about sharing cramped quarters with the Ice Queen beside him. "Right. About that power reroute. Unacceptable." Ari's fingers danced across her own interface. "The statistical probability of system failure. Sometimes you have to trust your gut. I fail to see how your digestive organs factor into engineering calculations." Despite the severity of their situation, Zach couldn't help but laugh. "It's an expression. It means—" A violent shudder ran through the ship, cutting him off. New warning lights flashed across their displays. "Hull breach in Section C," Ari announced, her professional mask slipping for just a moment to reveal genuine concern. Zach was already moving, pulling up the ship's schematics. "We can seal it, but I'll need access to the manual override controls." "Those are sealed behind 3 feet of reinforced bulkhead," Ari pointed out, "which is currently warping under spatial pressure." "Then we'll have to get creative." Zach grabbed his tool belt. "Coming?" Ari hesitated, her internal struggle visible in the slight twitch of her silver fingers. "Your plan violates every protocol in the book, I know. But unless you've got a better idea that works in the next 3 minutes..." Another tremor rocked the ship. Ari's posture shifted subtly, resignation warring with determination. "Very well, but I will document every violation. Wouldn't expect anything less." Zach headed for the access tunnel, not waiting to see if she followed. "Try to keep up." Her footsteps behind him, precise and measured even in crisis, told him all he needed to know. They had a ship to save, protocols be damned. And afterward, well, that narrow bunk in room 2187 was going to make for an interesting end to an already chaotic day. As they raced through the corridors, Zach couldn't resist one more jab. You know, for someone who hates improvisation, you're pretty quick on your feet. Movement efficiency is taught at the academy, Ari replied stiffly, unlike your human tendency to rush blindly into danger. Admit it, you're enjoying this a little. I do not enjoy anything, Engineer Anderson. I perform my duties. Call me Zach. He skidded to a stop at a junction, checking the schematics on his wrist display. And I've seen you smile when your calculations work out perfectly. Small one, right corner of your mouth. The look she gave him could have frozen plasma. You watch my mouth? Only professionally, he grinned, then pointed to a maintenance shaft. Through here. Hope you're not claustrophobic. Yartalians do not experience irrational fears. No? Then why are you hesitating? Ari pushed past him into the shaft, her movement deliberately graceful. I am calculating the optimal path considering spatial constraints. Sure you are. Zach followed, trying not to notice how the tight space forced them into close proximity. Just remember, my irrational human instincts are about to save this ship. That remains to be proven. As they crawled through the ship's arteries toward the hull breach, Zach found himself oddly enjoying their banter. Sure, she was rigid, arrogant, and probably documented his every breath as a violation of some regulation. But there was something fascinating about the way she approached problems, a precision that might actually complement his more intuitive style. If they survived the next few minutes, sharing quarters with her might not be the worst punishment the universe had devised. Challenging, yes. Potentially explosive, definitely. But boring, never. The breach alarm screamed louder as they approached their target. Time to put their differences aside and see if fire and ice could work together without destroying each other in the process. Ready to break some rules? Zach asked, pulling out his tools. Ari's response was to produce a datapad and begin recording. For the official record, I protest this entire approach. Noted. Now help me save our ship. The maintenance shaft narrowed as they approached the hull breach, forcing them to crawl single file. Zach tried to focus on the task ahead rather than the way Ari's blue skin seemed to shimmer in the emergency lighting, each movement fluid and precise. The manual override is behind this panel, he said, pulling out a sonic wrench. We'll have about 30 seconds once I remove it. 28.4 seconds, Ari corrected, her luminescent eyes scanning the readout on her datapad. And your proposed method will damage the panel's integrity by approximately... Zach yanked the panel free. Time to improvise. A blast of pressurized air whooshed past them. Warning lights bathed the cramped space in crimson, highlighting the angular planes of Ari's face as she shot him a look that could have melted Durasteel. That was not the approved removal procedure. Less criticizing, more helping. Zach reached into the exposed circuitry, his fingers dancing over the complex array of neural interfaces. I need you to monitor the power fluctuations while I redirect the... Your hand positioning is incorrect. Ari pressed against him in the tight space, her cool fingers wrapping around his wrist. The optimal connection point is here. The touch sent an unexpected shiver through him. Her skin was cooler than a human's, but not unpleasantly so. I thought Yartalians avoided physical contact. This is professional guidance. But she didn't immediately remove her hand. Of course, Zach smirked, even as he followed her adjustment. Purely professional. Unlike humans, we do not attach emotional significance to necessary physical proximity. Says the woman still holding my wrist. Ari withdrew her hand as if burned, her blue skin darkening slightly around her cheeks. Focus on the task, Engineer Anderson. Zach, he reminded her, working faster now, and I am focused. I can multitask. You know, that chaotic human trait you find so inefficient? The ship groaned around them, metal stress points screaming under the strain. Ari's datapad beeped urgently. Power levels are becoming critical, she reported. We have 14 seconds before... Got it! Zach made the final connection. The override panel hummed to life, and the emergency bulkhead slammed shut, sealing off the breach. The warning klaxons fell silent, replaced by the normal hum of ship systems. He turned to Ari, ready to celebrate, but the tight space made the movement awkward. They ended up nose to nose, her cool breath mingling with his. That, she said softly, was reckless, dangerous, and completely against protocol. But effective. But effective, she admitted, and for a moment he could have sworn he saw that slight smile he'd mentioned earlier. The moment stretched, neither of them moving despite the cramped position. Then Ari's datapad chirped, breaking the spell. Captain Barrett requires our presence in engineering, she announced, already backing away with that inherent grace. And I have 17 violations to report. Only 17? I'm losing my touch. Zach followed her out of the shaft, trying not to notice how her form-fitting engineering uniform highlighted the subtle variations in her blue skin tone. Want to grab some coffee first? I hear the mess hall's still intact. Yartalians do not consume stimulants. Right. Too emotional? Too inefficient. But there was something in her tone, a lightness that hadn't been there before. However, I would not object to reviewing the incident over a nutrient supplement. Wow, that's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. I did not intend... She stopped, noting his grin. You are engaging in that human behavior called teasing. Guilty as charged. Add it to your violation report. They emerged into the main corridor, where crew members were still dealing with the aftermath of the initial explosion. Ari paused, her expression becoming serious again. We still need to address the matter of shared quarters. Don't worry, Zach said, starting toward engineering. I promise to keep my chaotic human tendencies to my side of the bunk. There are no sides. The sleeping surface is exactly 76.2 centimeters wide. Sounds cozy. Ari's stride faltered slightly. You are doing it again. Doing what? Creating unnecessary tension through suggestive verbal patterns. Zach laughed. Trust me, if I was trying to create tension, you'd know it. She studied him with those luminescent eyes as if trying to decode a particularly complex equation. Humans are unnecessarily complicated. Part of our charm. Come on, let's go report our successful protocol violations to the captain. Then you can explain to me exactly how Yartalians handle shared sleeping arrangements. We don't. First time for everything. As they walked to engineering, Zach couldn't help but notice that despite her complaints about human inefficiency, Ari matched his pace perfectly. Maybe there was hope for their forced partnership after all. If nothing else, the next few days promised to be interesting. Assuming they didn't kill each other first. Or worse, actually start enjoying each other's company. Captain Barrett's debriefing lasted longer than necessary, largely due to Ari's insistence on detailing every regulation they'd broken. Zach leaned against the engineering console, watching her blue fingers gesture precisely as she outlined each violation. Furthermore, Engineer Anderson's unorthodox approach to the manual override system could have resulted in... But it didn't, Zach interrupted. In fact, our solution saved 3 adjacent sections from structural collapse. Ari's luminescent eyes narrowed. The potential risks were worth it, Captain Barrett cut in. Good work, both of you. Unconventional but effective. Now about your new quarters arrangement. Already sorted, Zach said quickly, ignoring Ari's sharp look. We're professionals. We can handle it. The captain's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Just try not to kill each other. We need you both functional. She paused. And Engineer Ari Tal, perhaps fewer violation reports tomorrow? Ari's posture stiffened. As you wish, Captain, though I must note that such leniency towards procedural violations. Dismissed, Barrett said firmly. As they left engineering, Zach couldn't resist. So, Rumi, want to check out our new accommodations? We have repair diagnostics to complete, which we can do from our quarters. The workstation there links to all ship systems. Our quarters, Ari corrected. Temporary quarters. Right, very temporary. Just us, one desk, one bunk, for however long it takes to repair the residential sector. Her blue skin darkened slightly around her cheeks again. You seem unusually focused on the sleeping arrangements. Just being practical. Something you appreciate, right? They reached room 2187, and Zach keyed in the access code. Ladies first. The door slid open to reveal a space that made cramped seem generous. A narrow bunk jutted from one wall, barely wide enough for one person, let alone two. A small workstation occupied the opposite corner, with barely enough floor space between to stand. Ari surveyed the room with the same intensity she'd used on the hull breach. This is significantly below minimum space requirements for two crew members. Cozy, isn't it? Zach stepped in, deliberately brushing past her. Don't worry, I don't snore. Much. Sleep habits are irrelevant. We will establish a rotation schedule. In this temperature, the environmental controls were still struggling after the accident, leaving the room notably cool. We'd freeze taking turns, unless ... he grinned. Yartalians are immune to cold too? Our body temperature is naturally lower than humans, she said, but he noticed she'd wrapped her arms around herself. We adapt. Sure, or we could be practical and share body heat. That would require prolonged physical contact. Purely professional contact, he echoed her earlier words. For survival. Ari moved to the workstation, but Zach caught the slight uptick at the corner of her mouth. I will document your suggestion in my report. Along with my 17 other violations? 23 now. She activated the console. Your disregard for personal space is quite consistent. Zach leaned over her shoulder, close enough to notice that her blue skin had a faint, pleasant scent, something like ozone in starlight. Just trying to live up to your expectations. She turned, probably to deliver another lecture on proper protocol, but the movement brought their faces inches apart. For a moment, neither spoke. Zach found himself studying the subtle patterns in her luminescent eyes like distant nebulae caught in crystal. You are doing it again, she said softly. What? Creating unnecessary tension. Maybe the tension is necessary. He straightened up, giving her space. For proper cultural exchange, of course. Of course. Was that amusement in her tone? We should focus on the repair diagnostics. Right, work first, cultural exchange later. Ari's fingers moved across the console, but he noticed they weren't quite as precise as usual. You are impossible. Improbable, he corrected. Not impossible. There's a difference. I am beginning to understand why you have had 3 previous engineering partners request transfers. And I'm beginning to understand why you're considered the most demanding expert in the Yartal Corps. Their eyes met again, challenge mixing with something else. Something that made the cramped quarters feel even smaller. We have work to do, Ari said finally. Always do. Zach moved to the other side of the workstation. But you have to admit, this partnership is going to be interesting. Interesting is not the term I would choose. No? What would you choose? Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. I believe humans would call it a disaster waiting to happen. Zach laughed. See? You're learning our expressions already. Next thing you know, you'll be making jokes. Unlikely, but that ghost of a smile was back. Now, about these power fluctuations. They settled into work, but Zach couldn't help noticing how Ari seemed to lean slightly closer than necessary when pointing out readings on his screen. Maybe, just maybe, this forced proximity wouldn't be such a disaster after all. Though he had a feeling neither of them would be getting much sleep in that narrow bunk. The ship's temperature dropped steadily over the next 12 hours. Zach watched his breath crystallize in the air as he worked on power distribution calculations at their shared workstation. Beside him, Ari's fingers moved across her console with their usual precision, though he noticed a slight tremor he hadn't seen before. Environmental control reports another 5-degree drop, she announced, her voice tight. Power reserves are insufficient for proper heating. Notice that. Zach rubbed his hands together, trying to restore circulation. How's your superior Yartalian physiology handling the cold? We are adaptable, but her blue skin had taken on a darker, almost indigo shade that he was beginning to recognize as stress. Right, that's why you're shivering. I am maintaining optimal molecular movement to generate heat. Zach stood, grabbing the emergency thermal blanket from his kit. Here, Your optimal molecular movement isn't cutting it. I do not require... She stopped as he draped the blanket over her shoulders, her luminescent eyes widening slightly at the gesture. Basic survival, he said before she could object. No protocols violated. Your own thermal regulation appears compromised, she observed, watching him return to his station. I'll manage. Ari was silent for a moment, then shifted the blanket. The surface area is sufficient for two if we optimize positioning. Zach raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting we share? I am suggesting efficient resource allocation, but there was something different in her tone, less clinical, more uncertain. He moved his chair closer, allowing her to spread the blanket over both of them. Their shoulders touched, and he felt her initial tension slowly ease as shared warmth built between them. On Earth, he said after a while, we have this tradition called winter gatherings. Families come together during the coldest months, share meals, tell stories. For thermal efficiency, for connection, community, he chuckled. Though the warmth helps. Yartalians do not gather without purpose. Isn't connection a purpose? She considered this, her profile sharp against the dim emergency lighting. We believe such emotional entanglements cloud judgment. They are inefficient. Like my engineering solutions? Precisely. But he caught that ghost of a smile again. Though I must admit, your methods have shown unexpected merit. High praise from the Ice Queen herself. Ice Queen? Earth expression. For someone cool and distant. He turned slightly, studying her reaction. Though maybe not as accurate as I first thought. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the cold seemed less pressing. Then a violent shudder ran through the ship, throwing them against each other. Warning! The ship's AI announced. Critical failure in primary power core. Backup systems engaged. Ari was already pulling up diagnostics. The temperature drop has affected the core's containment field. We have approximately 43 minutes before complete failure. Less if we can't stabilize it. Zach scanned the readings. We need to get to engineering. The corridors are approaching freezing temperatures. Then we'd better hurry. He stood, keeping the blanket wrapped around them both. Unless you'd rather freeze here? She rose gracefully, matching his stance. Your solution involves us walking through the ship, sharing a thermal blanket? Got a better idea? Several, all of which violate fewer protocols. But she didn't pull away. Though given the circumstances, you can add it to your report. They made their way through the darkened corridors, pressed together under the blanket. Each step brought them closer, their movements synchronizing out of necessity. Zach tried to focus on the crisis ahead, rather than the way her cool skin seemed to warm wherever they touched. Tell me about Yartal, he said, partly to distract himself. What do you do during your cold season? We do not have seasons. Our environmental systems are perfectly regulated. Sounds boring. She gave him a sidelong look. Efficiency is not meant to be entertaining. No. Then why are you almost smiling? A muscular response to temperature fluctuation. Sure it is. They reached engineering, and Zach keyed in his access code. Just like that muscle response when I fixed the hull breach? Or when I gave you the blanket? The doors slid open, revealing the chaos inside. Warning lights flashed across every console, and the core containment field flickered ominously. This is not the time for your human tendency toward inappropriate flirtation, Ari said, but her voice lacked its usual edge. Who's flirting? I'm making scientific observations. Zach moved to the main console, dragging her with him under the blanket. Like how you lean slightly closer when you're about to correct my calculations. I do not. Or how your eyes get brighter when you're trying not to laugh at my jokes. Focus, Engineer Anderson. Always am. He pulled up the core schematics, on lots of things. They worked in tandem, his intuitive adjustments complementing her precise calculations. The containment field stabilized gradually, their shared warmth under the blanket becoming comfortable rather than necessary. Your solution was, Ari paused, searching for words, unorthodox but effective. Just like our partnership? This time her smile was unmistakable, small but genuine. Perhaps. The core's hum returned to normal, and the emergency lights dimmed. They stood close under the blanket, neither moving to separate now that the crisis had passed. You know, Zach said softly, humans have another tradition for staying warm. More inefficient gathering? Dancing. Her luminescent eyes widened. That would violate at least 12 protocols, I know. He shifted slightly, not quite moving away. But it's excellent for generating heat through movement. Is this more scientific observation? Could be. Want to test the hypothesis? For a moment, he thought she might actually consider it. Then her professional mask slipped back into place, though not quite as firmly as before. We should check the secondary systems, she said, but she didn't step away. Always working. Zach grinned. One of these days, I'll teach you about human inefficiency. I believe you already are. She met his gaze directly. Most thoroughly. The way she said it sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the blanket. Maybe this disaster was turning out exactly as it should. After stabilizing the core, exhaustion hit them both hard. Zach felt his vision blur as he stared at the engineering console, the numbers swimming before his eyes. Beside him, even Ari's perfect posture had begun to slip. Your efficiency has decreased by 37%, she noted, stifling what might have been a yawn. And yours by at least 20, he countered, watching her blink slowly at her screen. We need rest. The temperature in our quarters is still freezing, I know. He saved their work and stood, keeping the thermal blanket around them. But we have options. Ari's luminescent eyes narrowed. If you suggest another Earth tradition, basic survival, he said, trying to keep his tone professional despite his racing heart. Shared body heat is the most efficient solution. She studied him for a long moment, her blue skin darkening slightly. You are suggesting we share the sleeping surface. Bunk, he corrected. And yes, unless you'd prefer to freeze while taking turns? The statistical probability of maintaining adequate body temperature alone is, she paused calculating, unfavorable. Is that a yes? That is a reluctant acknowledgement of limited options, but something in her expression softened. Though your solution does have certain logical merits. They made their way back to their quarters, still huddled under the blanket. The door slid open to reveal their tiny room, the narrow bunk suddenly seeming much more significant than before. So, Zach said, breaking the awkward silence, how do Yartalians handle sleeping arrangements? We don't. Her voice was quieter than usual. Physical proximity during rest is unprecedented. First time for everything. He tried to keep his tone light. I promise to stick to my side. There are no sides. The surface is 76.2 centimeters wide, I remember. He gestured to the bunk. Ladies first? Ari hesitated, then moved to the bunk with her characteristic grace. She lay down stiffly, pressed against the wall, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Zach took a deep breath and joined her, trying to maintain some space between them. It was impossible. The moment he settled, they were pressed together from shoulder to hip, the thermal blanket barely covering them both. This is highly irregular, Ari murmured, but he noticed she didn't pull away. Desperate times. He shifted slightly, trying to find a comfortable position. Try to relax. Your optimal molecular movement is making the whole bunk vibrate. I am perfectly relaxed. Sure, that's why you're as rigid as a support beam. Without thinking, he wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her closer. Here, for heat efficiency. She stiffened for a moment, then gradually melted against him. Her skin was cool against his, but not unpleasantly so. The contrast sent a shiver through him that had nothing to do with the cold. Your heart rate has increased, she observed quietly. Scientific observation? Professional interest? But she pressed closer, her head finding a natural spot against his shoulder. Though your temperature is surprisingly adequate. Zach chuckled, the sound rumbling through both of them. High praise indeed. Do not become overconfident. Yet her hand came to rest on his chest, fingers splaying over his heart. This is merely a practical solution. Of course. He traced small circles on her back, feeling her shiver. Purely professional. Exactly. Her voice was growing drowsy. Though your method of heat distribution is Unexpectedly effective. I'm full of surprises. She made a soft sound that might have been a laugh. That has become increasingly apparent. They fell silent, the ship's quiet hum mixing with their synchronized breathing. Zack found himself memorizing every detail. The way her blue skin seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, how her body fit against his as if engineered for it, the subtle scent of ozone and starlight that was uniquely her. Zack? Her use of his first name startled him. Perhaps some human inefficiencies have merit. He smiled into the darkness. I'll add that to my report. You do not write reports. Maybe I should start. Day 1. Made the Ice Queen admit humans might be right about something. She pinched his side lightly. I admitted no such thing. No? Then why are you cuddling? This is not cuddling. This is optimal positioning for heat preservation. Right, very scientific. Indeed. But she nuzzled closer, her cool breath ghosting across his neck. Though perhaps not entirely unpleasant. Zack tightened his arm around her, feeling sleep beginning to pull at him. Careful. Talk like that might make me think you're warming up to me. Impossible. Yet he could feel her smile against his skin. Though the temperature is becoming more tolerable. They drifted off together, professional boundaries blurring in the face of shared warmth and unexpected comfort. Just before sleep took him completely, Zack heard her murmur something in her native language, soft and musical, like starlight given voice. He made a mental note to ask her about it tomorrow. After all, they had plenty of cold nights ahead to explore this new efficiency. Zack woke to find himself completely entangled with Aerie. Sometime during their sleep, she had wrapped herself around him like a living blanket, her blue skin luminescent in the dim light of dawn's cycle. Her head rested in the crook of his neck, one leg thrown over his, her cool breath tickling his skin. He stayed perfectly still, savoring the moment before her usual rigid control took over. Her hair, typically pulled back in a severe style, had come loose, creating a silvery cascade across his chest. Your heart rate has increased again, she murmured against his neck, making him start. How long have you been awake? Long enough to collect interesting data on human sleep patterns. She didn't move away, which felt significant. You talk in your sleep. Heat crept up his neck. What did I say? Something about beautiful blue starlight. There was a hint of amusement in her voice. Most inefficient use of rest cycles. I was probably talking about the engine core, he deflected, though his arm tightened around her waist. Of course. She propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him with those luminescent eyes. Just as your elevated temperature is purely due to environmental factors? Absolutely. He reached up, tucking a strand of silver hair behind her ear. Very scientific. She caught his hand before he could withdraw it, studying his fingers with intense focus. Humans are unnecessarily warm. Part of our charm. It is distracting. Her fingers traced patterns on his palm, sending shivers through him. Makes it difficult to maintain proper cognitive function. Really? He grinned. The great Aerie Tal, distracted by a warm human? I did not say it was pleasant. No? Then why are you still holding my hand? She glanced at their intertwined fingers as if surprised to find them that way. Professional curiosity. About what? Human physiological responses. Her voice dropped lower. For instance, when I do this, she traced her cool fingers up his arm, watching his reaction. Zack's breath caught. Very thorough research. Indeed. She moved closer, her face hovering above his. Though I require more data. Far be it from me to stand in the way of science. Her lips curved in that ghost of a smile he was growing addicted to. Your assistance is appreciated. The space between them, charged with electricity, like the moment before a jump to hyperspace. Zack reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face. Her skin was cool silk under his palm. Aerie? Yes? I'm going to violate about 50 protocols. Before she could respond, he closed the distance between them, pressing his lips to hers. For a moment she froze, and he feared he'd miscalculated. Then she melted into him, her cool mouth warming against his, fingers curling into his shirt. The kiss was a fusion of opposites: fire and ice, chaos and order, earth and Yartal. When they finally parted, her eyes were glowing brighter than he'd ever seen. That was... She seemed to search for words, a rare occurrence. Inefficient? Highly. She traced his bottom lip with one finger. We should collect more data. Zack laughed, the joy bubbling up unstoppably. Multiple trials for accuracy. Precisely. This time she kissed him, precise and thorough, like everything she did. But there was a warmth there that had nothing to do with temperature regulation. The ship's intercom crackled, making them jump apart. Engineering team to the bridge. Immediately, reality crashed back in. They stared at each other, disheveled and breathing hard. We should, Ari began. Yeah, but neither moved. This complicates our working relationship. Probably. He brushed his thumb across her cheekbone, watching her eyes flutter. Worth it, though. She caught his hand, pressing a cool kiss to his palm that sent electricity through his entire body. Perhaps some complications have merit. I'll add that to my report. You still do not write reports. No? He sat up, keeping her close. Day 2. Made the Ice Queen melt. She pushed him away, but he caught her smile as she stood to straighten her uniform. You are impossible. Improbable, he corrected, following her. And you like it. I admit nothing. But when he reached for her hand, she let him take it. Though further research may be necessary, they headed for the bridge, maintaining professional distance but unable to quite hide their shared warmth. The ship's problems still loomed, the cold still bit, but something had shifted, like the first star breaking through a frozen night. And if Ari's fingers kept brushing his as they walked, well, that was purely for heat efficiency. Probably. The bridge buzzed with tension as Captain Barrett outlined their latest crisis. A cascade failure in the quantum drive threatened to tear the ship apart, but Zack barely heard the details. His attention kept drifting to Ari, standing perfectly straight beside him, her blue skin almost glowing under the emergency lights. Options? Barrett demanded. Standard protocols require a complete shutdown, Ari began, her voice steady. However, she glanced at Zack, something new in her luminescent eyes. He felt his heart skip. However, she continued, Engineer Anderson's previous solutions suggest alternative approaches might be viable. The bridge fell silent. Arital, pride of the Yartal Engineering Corps, suggesting they break protocol? Barrett's eyebrows shot up. I'm listening. Zack stepped forward, his shoulder brushing Ari's. The quantum fluctuations are following a pattern. If we reverse the polarity that would violate 17 safety regulations, Ari interrupted, but her tone was different now. Almost playful? Not to mention basic laws of physics. Since when has that stopped us? Their eyes met, electricity crackling between them that had nothing to do with the ship's systems. Us? She questioned softly. Well, I need your calculations to make it work. He grinned. Unless you're too worried about adding to your violation report. A ghost of a smile played at her lips. The report is already quite extensive. Focus, you two, Barrett cut in. Can you save my ship or not? Ari straightened, but Zack noticed she moved slightly closer to him. With proper modifications, Engineer Anderson's solution could work, though it would require precise timing and... She hesitated, then added, some improvisation. Did the Ice Queen just suggest we improvise? Zack whispered. She elbowed him subtly. I suggested nothing. I merely acknowledged the possibility. Whatever you're going to do it fast, Barrett ordered. Engineering is yours. They hurried through the corridors, no longer pretending not to touch. As they reached engineering, Ari pulled Zack aside. This plan of yours, she said, her cool fingers gripping his arm. The risk factors are high, I know. He covered her hand with his. But you trust me, right? She studied him intently. Trust is inefficient. But, she moved closer, her free hand resting over his heart. Your methods have proven Unexpectedly reliable. High praise from someone who documents my every violation? Perhaps. Her voice dropped lower. Some violations are worth documenting. The ship shuddered around them, breaking the moment. They sprang apart, rushing to their stations. Quantum drive destabilizing, Ari reported, her fingers flying across the console. We have minutes before total collapse. Then let's get creative. Zach pulled up the drive schematics. Ready to break some laws of physics? Only if absolutely necessary. But he caught her smile. Your influence is highly disruptive to proper procedure. You love it. I admit nothing. She moved to his station, leaning close. Though your chaos does have certain advantages. They worked in perfect sync, his intuitive leaps matching her precise calculations. When his hand brushed hers reaching for a control, neither pulled away. Power surge incoming, she warned. This is where your plan either works or tears a hole in space-time. Essentially, have a little faith, he said, catching her eye. Sometimes the impossible just needs the right partnership. Her expression softened, making his heart flip. Indeed. The quantum drive screamed as they implemented their solution, the ship bucking like a living thing. Warning lights flashed across every console. Containment failing. Ari's voice stayed steady, but her hand found his. Zach, he squeezed her fingers. Trust me. For a moment, the universe seemed to hold its breath. Then the drive's pitch changed, settling into a smooth hum. The warning lights faded. Drive stabilized, Ari announced, but she didn't let go of his hand. Your impossible solution actually worked. Our solution, he corrected. I couldn't have done it without your calculations. She turned to face him fully, still holding his hand. Perhaps that is the point. What do you mean? Your chaos, my order. Her free hand reached up to touch his face. Fire and ice. We are complementary. Are you admitting humans might have some good ideas? I am admitting that you... She paused, choosing her words carefully. You make me question everything I thought I knew. About efficiency, about emotion, about... About? Instead of answering, she pulled him down and kissed him, right there in engineering. Her cool lips met his with a certainty that made his knees weak. When they parted, her eyes were glowing brighter than he'd ever seen. About that. Very efficient use of communication, he managed. I thought so. She straightened his collar but kept close. Though more research may be required. For scientific accuracy? Naturally. Her smile was no longer a ghost. It was real and brilliant, and just for him. We should be thorough in our documentation. The ship's intercom crackled. Engineering report? They stepped apart, but something had fundamentally shifted between them. Like two stars finding their orbit, chaos and order finding their dance. All systems stable, Captain, Ari reported, thanks to some creative solutions. Good work, both of you. Get some rest. Zach raised an eyebrow at Ari. Rest? It would be efficient, she said primly, but her eyes sparkled. For heat regulation, of course. Of course, he offered his hand. Shall we conduct more research? She took it without hesitation. For science. As they headed back to their quarters, now truly theirs by choice, Zach couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the best solutions came from the most unlikely combinations. And if the Ice Queen had melted? Well, that was just basic thermodynamics. Probably. 2 months after their quantum dance saved the ship, life aboard the Stellar Guardian had found a new rhythm. The emergency repairs were complete, environmental systems restored, and crew quarters rebuilt. Yet Zach and Ari's small room remained unchanged, their narrow bunk still pushed against the viewport where they watched stars streak past each night. The Yartal High Council has requested my transfer, Ari announced one evening, her fingers intertwined with Zach's as they lay together. His heart stuttered. When? I declined. She turned to face him, luminescent eyes bright. They were displeased. You turned down a promotion? That's not very efficient. No, she agreed, tracing his jawline with cool fingers. But I find myself increasingly drawn to inefficient choices lately. My bad influence? Entirely. Her smile, once so rare, now came easily. Though perhaps influence is not the correct term. No? What would you call it? Instead of answering, she kissed him softly. When they parted, her expression held something he'd never seen before. Vulnerability. On Yartal, we have no word for what this is, she said quietly. The closest translation would be logical partnership, but that feels insufficient. Yes. She pressed her hand over his heart, a gesture that had become their private signal. Humans have many words for it, I believe. We do. He covered her hand with his. Want to hear them? She nodded, her blue skin darkening slightly in what he now recognized as a blush. Well, he began, pulling her closer. There's affection, but that's too simple. Devotion is closer, but still not quite right. Then there's love, she whispered, the word strange and beautiful on her tongue. I researched it in Earth's databases. An emotional state characterized by irrational behavior, elevated heart rates, and decreased efficiency. That's one definition. I experience all these symptoms around you. Her confession came with scientific precision, but her voice trembled slightly. It should be concerning. But I find I do not want it to stop. She met his eyes. Is that what humans call love? Zach's heart soared, getting warmer. Impossible. My body temperature remains constant. He laughed, the joy bubbling up unstoppably. Has anyone ever told you you're adorable when you're literal? Adorable is not a term typically applied to Yartal engineers. First time for everything. He brushed his thumb across her cheekbone. And yes, Ari, that's what we call love. She processed this with her usual thoroughness. Then I believe, I love you, Zach Anderson. Most inefficiently. He kissed her then, pouring everything he felt into it. All the warmth she'd awakened in him, all the chaos she'd brought to order, all the stars they'd crossed to find each other. I love you too, he murmured against her lips. Efficiency be damned. She pulled back just enough to give him her signature raised eyebrow. Language engineer Anderson. That's another violation for my report. Still keeping those? Of course. Her smile turned mischievous, though now they serve a different purpose. Oh, they remind me how one impossible human changed everything I thought I knew. She settled against him, cool skin against warm, about protocols, about emotion, about love, and your conclusions. That some chaos is necessary. That warmth can come from the coldest places. She pressed a kiss over his heart. That the most efficient path is not always the right one. Outside their viewport, stars painted patterns across their entwined forms. Human and Yartalian, fire and ice, chaos and order finding their perfect balance. The new crew quarters are ready, Zach mentioned, playing with her silver hair. We could have more space. Ari's response was to curl closer. This space is sufficient. Even with all my violations of personal boundaries, especially with those, she yawned, a surprisingly delicate sound. Though I may need to start a new report. The current one is quite full. Title suggestions? She pretended to consider. How to Fall in Love with a Chaotic Human, a Scientific Analysis. Subtitle, An Ice Queen's Journey to Warmth? Impossible Man. Improbable, he corrected, kissing her forehead. And yours? Yes, she agreed softly, already drifting toward sleep. Mine. And as the stellar guardian carried them through the endless night, their small room became a universe unto itself, where protocols met passion, where efficiency danced with emotion, and where love proved stronger than the space between stars. Together they had discovered that the greatest adventures weren't found in the vastness of space, but in the distance between two hearts learning to beat as one, even if one of those hearts required regular temperature regulation and extensive violation reports. Dear listeners, you've just heard a story that began with an accident on a spaceship and ended with something far greater. A tale of how two completely different beings, separated not just by culture, but by the very nature of their worlds, found their way to each other. Zach and Ari remind us that sometimes the most beautiful relationships are born from contradictions. That cold logic can melt in the warmth of a human heart, and chaos can find its own special order. Perhaps right now, some of you feel too rational for love like Ari, or like Zach, you're trying to reach someone's closed heart Remember, sometimes you just need to give yourself a chance. Allow yourself to be vulnerable. Let another person see the real you. Love rarely comes on schedule or follows protocols. It can begin with forced proximity, with irritation, even with conflict. But when two hearts find their common rhythm, a real miracle happens. A miracle capable of overcoming any differences. In the end, it doesn't matter who we are or where we're from, humans from Earth or engineers from distant Yartal. What matters is that we're capable of feeling, changing, and growing, able to find warmth in the most unexpected places. Let this story be not just entertainment for you, but a reminder. Sometimes you need to let your heart melt the ice of prejudice. For love, like the stars outside Zach and Ari's ship window, can illuminate even the darkest night. And who knows? Maybe your own love story will begin exactly where you least expect it, with warmth and faith in your hearts. For in the vastness of space and the infinity of time, the greatest discovery is still the warmth of another heart beating in rhythm with your own.